Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us for this hour on your Friday. This may be the highest attendance of any webinar More in Common has hosted, and we're really glad you're here because we have something we're genuinely excited to share with you today. So many of us on this call, we have folks from across the bridge building, depolarization space. So many of us are trying to tackle this phenomenon of affective polarization, our dislike or even hatred of people from the other party. But as we try and address it, we keep bumping into this other issue, which is that there's so much distrust in our institutions, in government, and in media that it's hard to convey the information that would help us relate to each other more and connect further. So as we try to address it, So today we're going to try and present something to you which looks at both of these issues, affective polarization and distrust. And we're going to present those in a single method. And we're really encouraged by what we have to present today. But it's also just the beginning. What we have here is not a country-changing solution, but it might be just one big piece of the puzzle. So we're eager to hear your thoughts and ideas in the Q&A at the end of our webinar today. And we're also really grateful to Knight Foundation, without whom this project would not be possible. And it's represented today by Ashley Zone, who is the Vice President of Learning and Impact for Knight Foundation. And we're very grateful for her to be here today. And so with that, Ashley, I want to turn it over to you to present some key context on the landscape of distrust in the country today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. We are very excited to be here. We're very excited to be supporters of More in Commons research. And also think it's important to share this context before you all get into some of the solution set that you all have been able to research. So I'm going to share a little bit about from our Trust in Media series that we work closely with Gallup on. And on the next slide, I think it's important to set the context for overall trust in media. And this is a trend that Gallup has been tracking for 50 years. And trust in media has hit its lowest point in 50 years as of 2020. And what you'll see on the next slide is that we've been looking at a number of different ways people express their attitudes about the media. And one of the things that we ask is, what's their overall opinion of the news media today? And what we're seeing, especially in 2020, is that unfavorable attitudes towards the media are growing across the partisan spectrum. But what was really unique in 2022 is that particularly independents were showing even more unfavorable opinions towards the media. That we also see rising unfavorable opinions among Republicans and among Democrats. On the next slide, one of the things that it's important to understand is that Americans see news as prioritizing profit over public service. So they primarily think of news organizations as first and foremost businesses that are motivated by financial interests and goals, rather than first and foremost being civic institutions that are motivated to serve the public interest. We have been trying to look at different dimensions of trust in a number of different ways. And in the most recent study that we released, one of the things that we did was really dive deep into a few different dimensions of trust. And so we asked Americans a number of different questions about how they see both national news organizations and local news organizations. We asked, do you think that they have the resources and opportunity to report the news fairly and accurate? We asked about reliability, to be relied on to deliver the information that someone needs. We asked the extent to which they think news organizations care, either about society or about the community, and how much do they care about the interests of their readers or viewers or listeners. And finally, we wanted to gut check, do Americans think that news organizations intend to mislead the public? And what we saw is that across the board, bottom four dimensions, there was a lot of correlation. And so we aggregated that into a dimension that we called emotional trust. And we then looked at how emotional trust affected a number of different things. And so on the next slide, what you'll see is first, we confirmed what we've seen in a number of other different kinds of analysis, which is that local news continues to be more trusted than national news organizations. So you see about 44% of Americans have high emotional trust in local news organizations, compared to really half of that having those opinions about national news organizations. And On the next slide, what we get into is why is that the case? And it was really on 2 of the 4 dimensions where we saw the most significant differences. We see that Americans perceive that local news organizations are not intentionally trying to mislead them, and that they really do care about the best interests of their readers and listeners and viewers. And so, what we see is 44 to 47% of Americans feel that way about local organizations, compared to half that when you look at how they feel about national news organizations. We also wanted to dive into, does trust in media matter to other things? And one of the things that we saw in our most recent study is that Americans who have higher emotional trust in national news organizations also have a more optimistic look about American democracy overall. So this means that they're more likely to think that elections are free and fair, news organizations are free from government interference, and that elected officials will advocate for the best interests of the communities that they represent. Most of our research series with Gallup has really been focused on news organizations or the media overall. But we actually recently released a series of articles that were specifically looking at the extent to which Americans are turning to individuals for information. And we see that about 9 in 10 Americans will say that they follow at least one type of public individual for information in particular. And so there's a number of different types of public individuals. And as a note, we defined a public individual in such a way that in the survey that we didn't want to say influencers because that had too much of a social media ring to it. And we didn't want to say public figures because people tended to think of that as politicians or sort of other kinds of celebrities. And so we wanted to encompass that broader group. And so we defined the term of public individuals. But what we see is that when Americans say that they're turning to journalists or scientists and experts or hosts of a program, they're really turning to those folks for news and current events. But there is still a group of folks, about a quarter of Americans, who turn to athletes and actors for news and current events. And so as we get back to the dimension of trust, it's important to recognize that Americans are trusting these public individuals when it comes to how they get their news and information. So you have a third of Americans who are saying that they trust the public individuals more than the news and organizations and outlets to report news and current events. And then when it comes to the trust in commentary in particular, it's actually split fairly evenly, the trust between news organizations and public individuals. And so I'm excited that I've had the opportunity to share this research with you all. I hope that as we start More in Commons conversation about their research, I think it sets some important context. So I'll turn it over to the More in Common team to share the new and exciting research that you all have developed.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I think this research really sets the scene for this larger environment of distrust in institutions that we live in. And it particularly highlights the importance of finding ways that we can share research that are seen as credible and can overcome this growing distrust. And for those of you who don't know or are not familiar with More in Common, just very quickly, we conduct research to better understand the forces that are driving societies apart. We also work on initiatives to build more united, resilient, and inclusive communities. We do this work in partnership with over 160 organizations in civil society and faith communities, education, media, and a whole host of other fields. We also have teams in the UK, France, Germany, and Poland. Before my colleagues here share the details and the results of this research study, I'll spend the next few minutes just giving you the context of this project. As we all know, first, partisan animosity or feelings of hostility between political parties has been increasing steadily since the 1980s. Academic research shows that this high level of partisan animosity is harmful at multiple levels. First, it increases general social distrust. And operating in this larger environment, individuals start to physically and socially distance themselves from people who belong to a different political party or have different political views. This leads to negative impact on our personal relationships. And partisan animosity also presents challenges for cross-party collaboration, as we see our political opponents as the enemy, as opposed to collaborators. And at the national level, this results in lower trust in institutions, which threatens our democracy. So thinking about this larger environment of partisan animosity, combined with our increasingly homogeneous social networks, this becomes a fertile ground for misunderstandings or exaggerations about how our political opponents think about different issues. We call this phenomena a perception gap. Essentially, a perception gap is the difference between what I think a group believes in versus what that group actually believes in. Since 2019, More in Common has done a lot of research on the perception gaps Democrats and Republicans have on a range of issues, ranging from immigration to support for political violence. And late last year, we published our newest report, Diffusing the History Wars, which explores the perception gaps Democrats and Republicans have when it comes to teaching and commemorating American history. And here I'm just going to show one example of Democrats' perception gap we found in this report. Here, Democrats hugely underestimate the percentage of Republicans who want to reckon with historical injustices. So for this example, we first ask Republicans, do you agree with this statement? Americans have a responsibility to learn from our past and fix our mistakes. Here we found that 93% of Republicans agree. We then asked Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you think would agree with this statement? And here we found that Democrats thought only 35% of Republicans would agree, which gives us a 58% perception gap from reality. While it's important to draw out the perception gaps we have about each other, the next crucial step is to correct these perception gaps. Research shows that correcting misperceptions is valuable to building healthy democratic norms. It allows us to see our commonality, but also real differences, which encourages more engagement across lines of differences. Correcting misperceptions also helps us reduce negative intergroup attitudes and also reduce support for violence against our political opponents. So in 2021, we tried to correct Americans' perception gap in a pilot research project. We presented perception gap data to research participants, hoping that by revealing to them their wrong assumptions about their political outgroup, we can correct their misperceptions and reduce partisan animosity. However, in reality, our research found that presenting perception gap data alone was not as effective. Our data was in fact met with skepticism. Over half of our research participants thought that the data is not believable, which significantly limited its effectiveness in changing people's mind and reducing their perception gap. And most of the research participants we talked to felt that the perception gap findings contradicted with their personal experience. For example, this Democrat here on the top left corner said, quote, "In my own personal experience, I haven't found the responses from Republicans to be the case. I think the answers reflect what they want the perception to be, but the words I've heard expressed are totally different." Other participants just shared that they felt the perception gap data contradicted with what they're hearing on the news or on social media. And some participants just generally didn't trust their political opponents and didn't buy into what they shared. So these challenges that we countered in the pilot study led us to develop the following questions. First, How can we overcome distrust in data and boost credibility in our larger environment of increasing polarization? Secondly, how can we correct perception gaps and reduce partisan animosity? So to address the first problems of distrust in data, we explore academic research on what mechanisms that are proven and tested to be effective in increasing credibility in research and also lowering feelings of animosity between groups. We found that first, hearing someone explaining their beliefs is more persuasive than reading about that person's beliefs. Secondly, personal stories or first-person narratives are more persuasive than facts alone. Thirdly, exposure to sympathetic outgroup members can work to lower feelings of animosity. And lastly, endorsement by in-group members boosts the message's credibility. As we design our research, we also learn from the Strengthening Democracy Challenge hosted by Stanford University. This is a mega study where 25 interventions were selected from hundreds of submissions, and they were tested on their ability to reduce partisan animosity, among many other outcome variables. And we built off this study's successes by first adopting a similar experiment design. We designed our research project as a randomized control trial, which means that there is a control group that acted as a benchmark. Secondly, we measure the effects of our intervention by looking at a similar outcome variable, focusing on partisan animosity or feelings of hostility towards our political opponents. This allows our research to be comparable to these successful interventions tested in the SDC. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Callista.
Hello, thank you, Coco. So following our literature review, we developed our main research question, which is, can perception gap interventions that include videos of in-group member reactions boost their credibility and reduce partisan animosity? And what I mean by in-group member reactions, oh, could you go back for 1 second, Coco? Thank you. What I mean by in-group member reactions is if I'm a Democrat, I would be seeing reactions from other Democrats in the video. And if I'm a Republican, I'd be seeing reactions from other Republicans in the video. And I'm going to go more into detail now about that. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk through the method that we developed to answer this question. And I would recommend that for this section, please move any windows that might be blocking the screen at the moment, because I'm going to use a lot of visuals to explain how we did this. And if you miss something along the way, you won't be able to follow the results at the end. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So first, we sampled 4,800 US adults, and then we randomly assigned these participants to one of 4 conditions. The image here shows how people were assigned. So first, we had people self-identify as a Democrat, Independent, or Republican. And then we took all the Democrats and Democratic leading independents, and we randomly assigned them to either a control group or one of our 3 treatment groups, which are shown here on the left. And then we did the same thing for Republicans and Republican leaning independents, which is shown here on the right. We randomly assigned them to a control group or one of our 3 treatment groups. And people who were true independents, who shown here in the middle, were randomly assigned to either group. And now I'm going to explain the control and treatment conditions in detail. So the control condition. The control condition was a 4-minute long video ad for a standing desk. So it basically had nothing to do with politics, and it was very unemotional. And then our first treatment group was treatment B. This was our written statistics only condition. So in this condition, participants had the opportunity to read our 2022 perception gap statistics on teaching US history, and that is all they did. This image here is just one of the statistics that was shown in the green box. Our next treatment group, which is treatment C, this combined the exact same statistics that we presented in treatment B with video footage of the participants' outgroup member talking about how they think US history should be taught. So in this case, if I were a Democrat, I would be reading statistics about Republicans' views on teaching US history, and then also watching clips of Dawn here talk about how they think history should be taught. And then finally, our last treatment group was treatment D. And this condition was exactly the same as treatment C, so the same statistics and video clips, except it included reactions from in-group members as well. So if I were a Democrat, I'd be reading the statistics on Republicans and watching clips of Republicans such as Dawn talk about US history. And then I would also see members of my own in-group, so other members like Cheryl here in the corner at the top, watching these clips as well. This treatment group is really important and it's a little hard to understand without more visuals, so I'm actually going to talk through it now in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to show screenshots of treatment D in chronological order. The video starts off with a brief explanation of what we did, shown here. And then the participant is briefly introduced to their in-group members, in this case, Democrats. They watch short clips of these members talking about how they are skeptical that Republicans will agree with them on how US history should be taught, and how they do not think that they have anything in common with Republicans at all. They then watch short clips of Republicans, such as Bonnie here, talking about how they think US history should be taught. And they watch these alongside their fellow in-group members, as you can see here, again in the top right corner. They then read the perception gap statistics. And then at the end, they watch a few clips of their Democrat in-group members talking about their thoughts on what the Republicans said. So it's important to know that their reactions are sincere but modest. They're not over the top, like something you might see in a TV ad, but they do exhibit a change from at least what they were saying at the beginning of the video. And after the participants watch the video, so again, we just showed the videos for treatment D, but after the participants watched the videos, they completed an attention check and then were asked a series of questions on partisan animosity, outgroup attitudes, and then also whether or not they trusted the information that was presented to them, as well as a number of other questions on their conception of division in the country and other relevant variables. So we had two main hypotheses for this experiment. Our first hypothesis was that compared to a control group, groups exposed to perception gap interventions, so our treatments A, B, C, and D, would express less partisan animosity. And our second hypothesis was that the group shown the video with in-group member reactions, so treatment D, which is the one I went through in detail, would experience the largest effects in reducing partisan animosity. And thank you very much. I'm going to pass it off to Stephen. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Calista. So let's get into what we found. So here I want to show you the results separately from the Democrats and the Republicans. So the control group, again, here, this is the group that just saw a video about a random online product at a desk. We can see that the baseline measure against which we're going to measure the efficacy of these interventions, we're starting at a level of 24 and 25 out of 100. So feelings that are pretty cold, where 0 would be very cold and 100 would be very warm. We're starting off at that baseline 24, 25. The first intervention which we tested, which is just the static statistics that aren't in video form and don't include any video of outgroup members, have a little bit of an effect, up to 33 in the case of Democrats and 29 in the case of Republicans, but relatively modest effect. The first video that we showed, which includes those video testimonies of outgroup members intermixed with those statistics, has a significant increase from that baseline up to about 13 points in the case of Democrats and 12 points in the case of the Republicans. And just a note about the visualization here, we're showing the error bars there. So the error bars are 95% confidence intervals around those statistics. And then finally, for the video D, which we hypothesize would be the most effective, we see significant jump here of about 20 points. So in the case of Democrats, we see an increase from 25 to 43. In the case of Republicans, from 24 all the way up to 46. Now, let's put that into context. So earlier in the presentation, Coco mentioned that we were inspired by and learned from the Stanford Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which, as she mentioned, They collected 252 ideas of ways that you could reduce the amount of hostility between Republicans and Democrats. They picked the 25 that they thought were most promising, and those 25 are shown here in the bottom half of your screen. And you can see that what we have here on the x-axis is relative to a baseline. So the baseline here is indicated at 0, and then you can see as you move towards the right, how many points increase in warmth were shown as a result of that intervention. And you can see that they range from low of a 1-point increase up to a 12-point increase. And 12 points was the most successful intervention that Stanford tested. So our interventions are here at the top in blue. You can see that our statistics intervention, which was one which doesn't include any of the videos, did about average compared to the Stanford interventions. The one that included outgroup members does quite well, does better than the 25 interventions tested. But then finally, our video, that included members of the in-group, people who go on this journey of persuasion, starting off skeptical, then hearing statistics, then seeing the faces of outgroup members expressing their own opinions and how they interact with that. We see that that jump is 20 points. And so it's significantly higher than any that was tested in the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. And we were thrilled with these results. We were optimistic going into this randomized controlled trial that we would have something that would make a contribution. But we wanted to make sure that we followed all protocols here and this passed all scrutiny from academics. And so we have shared these findings with the authors of the Stanford paper, Rob Willer in particular, and gotten their feedback, and that's been incorporated into the manuscript, which we just published today and which Michelle has linked to in the chat if you'd like to read that academic write-up. So let's put this into a little bit of context. What does it mean to move people to a 45 or a 46 on a 100-point scale towards their outgroup? Well, one way of thinking about it is that it reverses the decline in feelings towards the out party, versus the decline in warmth towards the out party that we've seen over the last 40 or so years. If you look here on the left, on that blue line, what that's showing is out party rating on a 100-point scale going back to the end of the Carter era, the beginning of the Reagan era, when most Americans would describe people from the opposite party in pretty neutral terms, not best friends, but also not with animosity. And so that level, 44, 46 out of 100, is where we are returning Americans to after they watch this 5-minute video and find that there's more commonality than they anticipated. Furthermore, we wanted to see if, beyond just this kind of abstract question of warm feelings versus cold feelings, if people would be more likely to describe members of the outgroup party in positive and in more positive terms. And we see that here, where those pink circles are showing you the group that got that group D intervention. And you can see that they're more likely to describe members of the outgroup with characteristics such as being caring or reasonable than people who are in the control group. And conversely, we wanted to see if they'd be less likely to use negative words to describe the outgroup party. And we see that trend as well, where people are more, they're less likely to describe the outgroup party in terms that are critical and negative, such as being hateful or arrogant. And so we see this change in conception of how the outgroup party is in terms of their character. But that's the end of the good news. Here's the challenge. These treatment effects disappear within 1 week. So what we did to establish this was we went back to 3,600 of those initial 4,800 people who completed this exercise and this survey. And we just asked them, how warm or cold do you feel towards the outgroup party on the scale of 0 to 100? And you can see here in these second rows that say 1 week later, you can see what the average scores were across the 4 interventions. And you see that they're all in the low 20s. And so all of those gains that we saw after the intervention that moved people up into the 30s, up into the 40s, disappear within approximately 1 week as people watch cable news, are on social media, interact with people in real life, etc. And so we see that this effect is monumental, but fleeting. And so this brings us to a real part of the conversation that we want to have with this group and that we'd love to engage with you in the Q&A is, what are ways that we might think about building a program that would systematically and continuously show this sort of content to people so that the effect would be sustained rather than disappearing. So this is just another way of illustrating that. You can see that the immediate effects across those 4 groups, A, B, C, and D, drop down within 1 week. So now I'm just going to conclude here with a couple questions and comments that frame where we are today with this project and how it might be of value to people on this call who are similarly looking at these questions of how we've reduced hostility in the country. So we did manage to present these findings to the Stanford community that was involved in this mega study, as I mentioned before, and have been in collaboration with them and making sure that our results are valid and work to be compared relative to the findings that they had in their study. And now I want to just talk through some of the challenges and limitations here. So what we have done here was we specifically focused the content on this quite controversial and polarizing subject of teaching US history, very succinctly. And this is a gross generalization, but it gets the point across. Democrats tend to think that Republicans want to teach an American history to students that is just about glorifying the United States as an exceptional country that whitewashes and overlooks all of the hideousness of slavery and segregation and sexism and homophobia and all of the problems that our society continues to grapple with. And Republicans tend to think that Democrats only want to focus on those things, on the stories of oppression and of abuse in the American story. And what we have focused this intervention on is correcting those misperceptions, but it's a specific issue. If we were to look at other issues and try to do misperception corrections on other issues, we don't know if the effects would be the same size. It could be larger, they could be smaller. So there's an external validity or an extrapolation question here that we are still curious about. Crucially, this is a big peak that we see in increase of warmth towards the outgroup party, but it fades very quickly. And so it's not a solution to the broader challenge, but it might be a key piece in that solution because it might be informative for content creators, whether those are in local or national media or in education or in other spaces, about ways that you can be persuasive and reduce hostility between parties. And that raises the final question, which is, what are those mechanisms? How can we disseminate content that uses these key mechanisms in a way that is sustained and in a way that has broad reach, not just reaching people like ourselves who are curious about these things and who are committed to ideas of depolarization, but reaching crucially those groups who are the most entrenched in their opposition to the other party and have the deepest levels of animosity. Okay, and this is my last 3 slides here. I just want to talk about ways that we might think beyond this specific application to the work that many of you on this call will be doing. And this is just a conversation starter. These aren't finite ideas. And I should say that we don't have evidence about these particular claims, but these are some ways that we might think about drawing lessons from this intervention that could be applied to the work that some of you are doing. So first, let's take this challenge of building trust in elections, which I know is a major motivating question for many in our field. The problem, of course, being that there's declined trust in the integrity of our election system, and that leads to skepticism in our democracy and lower trust in our institutions in general. How could we draw from what we've just presented to a question such as this? Well, we might do it in written form by showing a journey of persuasion. We think that this phrase, journey of persuasion, is really at the core of the efficacy of this intervention. And what that might look like is drawing on stories and anecdotes of individuals who are coming from a place of skepticism, but are then introduced to information that leads them to have a different outcome, that have a different concluding perspective than the one they started with. In terms of video interventions, you might similarly feature skeptical in-group members, people who, for instance, are Trump Republicans, believe the election was stolen, who convey their skepticism, who then encounter evidence and stories that conflict with that and then show that concluding perspective as well. That journey of persuasion seems to be at the core of what's working here. And then finally, if you work on maybe more conventional contact theory based interventions that are about reducing hostility between groups or reducing discrimination or feelings of antipathy towards minority populations, and you want to increase that warmth towards them, there might be things to draw from this project as well. So for instance, in doing op-eds, sympathetically show a journey of people who have reservations or concerns or who might have stereotypical ideas of an outgroup population, and then show that journey where they encounter sympathetic members of that outgroup, sympathetic members of a group such as Muslims or immigrants who they have skepticism of, and then show where they land on the other side of that intervention. And the same could be said of videos, right? Ways that can feature members of that outgroup and tell the stories of people who are skeptical about them, coming to a place of maybe relaxing some of those assumptions and growing in warmth towards that group as a whole. So that's our presentation today. We'd love to take questions. If you have any questions about Ashley's presentation, about the general context of distrust, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And if not, then we on the More in Common team would be happy to entertain any questions you have about our methods, about our findings, or anything else. Okay, so our first question is, were there partisan differences? So yes, there were. And fortunately, we have a slide on that. Coco, I wonder if you could just pull that up. So we looked at this. We have categories of very conservative to very liberal, and then we have categories of strong Democrat to strong Republican and everything in between. And I think the evidence here is interesting in two ways. The first way is that, as you might expect, people who are strong partisans, who identify as a strong Democrat or a strong Republican, often start at the lowest baseline level. So you can see here, for instance, strong Democrats in the top left, their baseline is 21 out of 100, whereas for independents in the middle, their baseline is 35. So they're starting off at different points. But what's crucially interesting to us is that the effect size, meaning how much they moved from left to right, how much they moved from cold to warm, is actually rather stable across these groups. We see a high of 28 among those who lean Republican. We see a low of 15 among independents. But crucially, we see double-digit increases in warmth, regardless of where people are on this partisan spectrum, which is encouraging to us. Okay, I'm going to read this question from Will. Taking a step back and looking at the foundation before your treatment, does your data suggest any difference in partisan animosity in states that are more politically homogenous, as in deep red or deep blue states, compared to states that are more politically mixed, swing states? I'll take a shot at that, and then if anyone else wants to weigh in, please do. We haven't done a lot of analysis at the state level with our sample sizes. It'd be possible to do that analysis of big states like Texas and New York, but probably not possible to do that analysis among smaller states. My intuition is that it would matter more whether you identify as a strong partisan than whether your state, your geography is purple, but that's just an assumption at this point because we haven't run that analysis. Okay, Michelle, do you want to manage from here?
Yes, there we go. Okay, so I'll everybody and people seem to be doing it. Just post your questions in the Q&A and we'll take as many as possible until the top of the hour here. So next question is from Kevin Loker. When people were in the experiment, what did they see as the source or context for what they were watching?
I can take that. Yes. Coco, could you go back to the methods slide or the methods section? And the first slide that shows the green box that says what we showed our participants. We have the text for you. So we're actually very deliberate in making the color we used for this green. We did not, very politically neutral color here. We used green throughout the entire video. And this is what they read. So throughout 2022, a group of nonpartisan researchers conducted an extensive study of attitudes towards teaching American history, including interviews and national surveys. That's all they knew. Thanks for your question.
Okay, great. And then the next question is from Mia. Any thoughts on leveraging this in live interactions, maybe similar to Braver Angels methods?
So I think that the mechanism that's at play here, where people have prior assumptions and then they meet members of an out group and those interactions conflict with their expectations, and then they come out on the other end, I think it's the same mechanism or a very similar mechanism to what's happening in Braver Angels encounters. I think that the challenge of the Braver Angels model is scale. How can you do this in a way that affects millions of people? And so what's encouraging to us is that using the mechanisms that we have here, we can package a video that can be disseminated really broadly, at least in theory, and that we might be able to have some of those powerful effects that Braver Angels is able to generate, but in a way that doesn't require that people attend an evening-long event and that they, et cetera, have all of that encounter themselves in person. Yeah.
Next question, what do you think is the role of media's business models, attention economy, in those challenges when media often has the incentive to optimize for clicks and outrage instead of social cohesion? How could this be addressed? Maybe.
You want me to try to take that
I was
one?
gonna say, it looks like an Ashley question.
Sure. So listen, I think this question gets at some of what we were talking about in terms of local, national news versus local news organizations, and the extent to which people are seeing media organizations as there to serve them and care about them, or whether they see these organizations as having a for-profit motive. And what we're seeing is that primarily Americans see media as having a for-profit motive.
Thank you. Next question. How important do you think the use of video is important relative to the journey of persuasion, which can be shared in other ways, verbalized, written, etc.?
I can take this first, and team, please jump in. I think from what we've learned from academic research is that hearing people sharing their stories, especially their own personal stories and experiences, is very powerful, sometimes more so than just reading about their stories and thoughts alone. But even though we didn't test the comparison between reading someone's stories versus watching it in the video, it's perhaps the mechanism that's most powerful. It's this journey of persuasion, as Stephen mentioned earlier, that if possible, demonstrate it in visual or video form, but in written communications, it could be powerful as well.
Great. Next question is, what do you think is the underlying principle for why the treatment decays after 1 week? What is at the heart of why it works in the moment and then wears off?
Okay, well, I'll take a first shot at that. The information environment that we're in is bombarding us constantly. Cable news, social media feeds, regular news feeds, personal interactions that we're having with family members and friends who disagree with us. And so this mighty video of 4 to 5 minutes is contending against all of that. And so it's much like in a general advertising campaign, you often hear that someone needs to hear something 17 times or 12 times in order for it to stick. And so repetition is a key part of advertising and persuasion efforts. We would think that the same principle applies here, which a single treatment here isn't effective in combating and overcoming all of the other information that people are getting, which selectively features the most outrageous and the most offensive and the most polemic moments in politics.
Next question, are you in touch with major media companies to help educate them about how to best tell stories about journeys of persuasion to reach a broader audience?
Did
you want to say something else, Coco, before we jump onto that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries. This is actually kind of related to the next question. I just thought of, there's this event I went to where people are saying, can we sell democracy the way we sell beer? And I think it points to the importance of repeating these interventions in different ways and with nuances that keeps reminding people that we do have commonalities and we do have real differences, but let's not distort reality and just focus on the exaggerated images of each other. So repetition is probably key to counter against the decay effects.
Thank you. Next question is, do you see variation in effect size by age?
I don't
Might
think
have
we've looked at
implications.
that.
Okay.
That's a great analysis for us to run after that. We can do that one and the geographic one. So far, we've looked at party ID, ideology, and I think we've looked at hidden tribe as well. But no, we haven't looked at age. That's a good one for us to look at.
And Eric, who had that question, he said that it might have implications for value of incorporating interventions like these in educational contexts. So lots of ideas, and thank you all for the ideas. If you have ideas but not a question, you can put them in the chat so we can save them after and think about ways that we can expand on these methods. Did you review deep canvassing process studied by Brookman and Kalla? There's a link that they provided to you, but I don't know if there was any research that you want to talk about for this. Brookman and Kalla?
So Brookman and Kalla were at the Stanford presentation that I gave and presented some research there. So I was able to sort of share these findings with them. I'm vaguely familiar with this study about the efficacy of people telling stories. I can't remember if the issue was about abortion maybe or transgender identity, but that having personal encounters where the person isn't lobbying for an issue or trying to persuade you from a place of abstraction, but telling a personal story that is about their own experience that can be effective. I think it's a great comment because I think they're very related to the efficacy that we see here.
From Jeanette Wang, like with other treatments for polarization, there's huge decay within only a few days. Do you think that it's worth researching the decay period, maybe to deepen our academic understanding of the social forces working against depolarization efforts?
I can jump in first. I personally think it would be fascinating to capture where the different forces are coming from and how they filter into our information ecosystem, how it impacts our feelings about the outgroup. But I don't know how difficult it will be to measure so many different layers of information. Like it might come from our friends or family, it might come from social media. How do we capture these impacts? But Stephen, do you want to jump in?
I agree with everything Coco just said. I think it would be really interesting to do. I think we're more focused at the moment on thinking about ways that we can equip large communicators or communicators that have a wide reach in terms of audience to sort of implement some of these principles and to draw on these mechanisms in the way that they do their own communication. I think that mountain up ahead is the biggest challenge that we're focused on at the moment, but it would be really interesting to see. Yeah, it would be interesting to see. We have a colleague, Daniel Yudkin, whom we work with, who sometimes does studies that people use their cell phones and they get pinged at random moments throughout their day and they get asked questions, which could be a good method of capturing data about what information people are receiving and what mood they're in and who they're around, and then asking them related questions about outgroup perceptions or warmth towards the outgroup and seeing what correlations we might identify there.
Thank you. Next, we have a question about the media. Do you think a media source, cable news or other, could exist today that reports the news in a fair way and reports the news down the middle in a non-biased way? Seems like people tune in the news to hear it in a way that supports their bias. Ashley, I think you might have some research, something about that. Yeah.
So I won't speak to a specific news source. There's plenty of charts online that try to map out where different news organizations lie. But one thing that Al might find interesting is in the public individuals research that we just released, we asked people why they follow public individuals. And some of that is around, they want to hear different perspectives, but we actually explicitly asked, does this person have a different point of view than yours, and very few people are following individuals for a different point of view. They're either following them because they trust them, they like their personality, or more likely they agree with them than they disagree with them.
Thank you. Another question is, any additional information on how you segmented the group beyond partisan leaning would be great, and what you learned from that.
Yeah, sure. We could go back to the slide that shows that beautiful image, Coco, that of how we assign people into groups. Segment, we had people self-identify as Democrat, Independent, or Republican. So that's what we asked them. In terms of segmentation, I don't know if you're talking about our hidden tribe segmentation. So this is how this graph shows how we randomly assigned people a treatment group. So that's what's going on here. True independents were randomized into either group, Democrats and independent leaning. Independents who lean Democrat received the Democrat videos, vice versa for the Republican videos. And then following our experiment and in our analysis, we did subsequent analysis where we looked at, as we mentioned, different political affiliations. So if you're really strongly leaning Democrat or not as much. We also looked at our hidden tribe segmentation as well. But that was after the experiment took place. I hope I answered your question well.
I have a follow-up question. What did you find on the hidden tribes? So you kind of touched on that, but if you could discuss a little bit more about.
I think the findings correlate strongly with what we found by partisan identity and by ideology.
Another question, do you think the surprise factor could help convince news outlets to promote videos like this? They could come up with a sensationalist headline that could still drive clicks. This X will surprise you. Do you think that sample headlines that are compelling but not damaging could be promoted along with the videos that would encourage outlets to share it?
Yes, I can take this. I can already imagine a BuzzFeed article that says, well, Republicans are not that different than you. But jokes aside, in one of our previous newsletters, I'm going to paste the link here, that we partner with American Press Institute and looked at what kind of news stories Americans want. And we actually found that Americans want both the articles that criticize what's wrong and the different viewpoints, but others also want celebrate what's being right in American society. So I do think that there is space for this kind of content.
Thank you. Did the Stanford's SDC treatments also see the same kind of decay in terms of effectiveness? Do you recall any of the other?
I don't know if they've published those data. I'd have to go back and look. I know that the general assumption from the authors is that there were decay effects, but I don't know if they've published those findings. It's a good question. I don't think either of you know, Coco or Calista? Yeah, from correspondence with the authors, they weren't surprised by this because they also anticipated decay effects, but I don't know if they actually measured them for their study.
And we touched on this earlier, but I think more specific, I'm curious how you think about gender, race, ethnicity, etc. in the context of your results. Did you do any of this research in other languages besides English?
I can answer first, but team, please jump in. We didn't do the experiment in any other language. It would be really interesting and see how, if people will feel, especially non-English speaking Americans would feel more relatable in watching videos of the others who speak in their native language. And in terms of the impact of gender, race, ethnicity, it's interesting to note that the effect sizes for Democrats and for Republicans are different. And one potential reason is because they watch different versions of videos. And one video has more diversity of viewpoints, especially the one for Democrats. And perhaps that could be a source of influence on how persuasive or convincing the video is. But it would be really interesting to look into the data crosstab by those demographics. Team, anything to add?
James asked if it's possible to see the videos themselves. And I know Stephen put his email in the chat. If you want to see them, we can certainly send them out to you. Just please shoot us an email, Stephen@moreincommon.com.
And we have a folder with all of the videos and all of the statistics and everything that was relevant here. And we need to manage access to that. So just send us an email and we'll just manually add you to that folder.
Somebody wanted to circle back to the question whether we're connected to major media outlets. I know not necessarily, but people here, if you are, that's a great way for us, if you know somebody, you want to connect us. And actually, I don't know if you have ideas on ways that we could connect with major media outlets for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best things about having a webinar like this is to get the word out about this great research. And then hopefully the audience members, if you guys know a reporter who would be interested in covering something like this, reach out to Stephen. And if they're interested in the Gallup research, certainly reach out to me.
Thank you. From Will, regarding the decay of the positive effect, he says, first, I wonder if going through the treatment with multiple issues would decrease decay, as each iteration would reinforce the larger pattern that we tend to misperceive political opponents. Second, I wonder if providing a second treatment for people would go through the first one that focuses on the decay problem itself might lessen decay, meaning a treatment with data and in-group video reactions, etc., regarding the decay itself. It's more of a statement, but I don't know, we have other ideas that we're going to try
next. The audience has a lot of good research questions to dive into.
Yes, thank you so much.
I think one comment there is just one thing we're trying to grapple with is the time constraint here. So to feature multiple issues and have in-group and out-group member reactions and introductions, etc., we're starting to expand beyond the 5 minutes to 10 minutes, etc. And so as we think about media partnerships and how this could be, integrated into their content, there's kind of two formats. Either it's a short advertisement or it's a lengthier program, or maybe it's a social media video that's a bit longer. But that's one of the things we're trying to figure out is what's the shortest version of this that can have the maximum impact.
Great. And then a question from Al that I think would be good from Ashley and somebody from More in Common to answer $1 million question. There is less trust in our institutions today than ever. Media getting one of the lowest ratings. How do we begin reversing this?
That is the $1 million question, Al. I think that is a great question. What I like about, what excites me about this research from More in Common is that you guys have really tested an intervention and really been able to see an actual difference in people's beliefs, which is hard to find in research. Like it's not, you don't always, so when you test a hypothesis, you often wind up, not confirming your hypothesis. And so the fact that you guys have been able to find an intervention that did have an impact, I think is incredibly promising. The big societal attitude scale changes are much harder, but I think what makes this research so exciting is that there's an intervention. We know that it works, even if it's just for a week, it works.
Anyone else from More in Common? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that made our intervention effective and other interventions from the Strengthening Democracy Challenge so effective is the sympathetic outgroup exemplar. Also deep canvassing, right? You're talking to somebody from your outgroup. And so I think building trust is really going to have to happen at the local level. It's going to have to be grassroots. I mean, that's my personal opinion. And I think it also is shared by other researchers and people in this community. And also, as Ashley pointed out, a lot of a lot of people do trust their local journalists, and there's a lot of trust in local news. And there are a lot of really great local news researchers and institutions that are doing that really important community building work that creates trust and generates trust. I highly recommend you look into the work at the American Press Institute. They talk and think about this a lot. So there's definitely a lot of, there's possibilities, and I have a lot of hope, and I think starting where you live is a good place to start.
We'll have time for one more question, and then we'll have Stephen close this out. But as a reminder, we did put the links to all of this in the chat. If you're watching this video after the fact, the More in Common presentation and the academic manuscript can be found online on moreincommon.com. The last question is, what motivated participants to participate in this research?
So we worked with YouGov, which is one of the largest polling agencies in the country, and one of the largest in the world. And their research participants are part of an online panel, and they take surveys about many different topics for a small compensation for an incentive. So these aren't entirely randomly selected people. These are people who participate in online surveys. And that's it. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. A big thank you to Ashley for joining us for this hour and presenting Knight's research with Gallup. And please do follow up with us by email if you'd like to gain access to the videos and the other content. We'd be happy to share things with you. And if you have ideas for how we could connect with major media who might want to feature this content or learn from us about ways they might be storytelling in a way that will reduce affective polarization, please do reach out. And with that, I'll say enjoy the rest of your Friday, and thank you so much.